Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union on 22nd June 1941, Belarus, then part of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, was rapidly occupied by Wehrmacht forces as part of Army Group Center's advance toward Moscow. The region's strategic position made it a crucial axis for German logistics. Major railway lines connected the Eastern Front with the Reich, supplying frontline troops and transporting resources. By August 1941, German military control extended across nearly all of Belarus, but the speed of the occupation left gaps in security, particularly in forests, swamps, and rural hinterlands. These areas would become the base of Soviet partisan activity. Pre-war Soviet planning had considered the possibility of enemy occupation, However, these measures were not fully institutionalized before the invasion. The collapse of frontline units and the encirclement of large Soviet forces in the summer of 1941 created the conditions for the emergence of small, isolated groups of soldiers, officers, and Communist Party officials behind German lines. These groups would form the nucleus of the Belarusian partisan movement. German occupation policy combined military control with administrative structures under the Reichskommissariat Ostland, headed by Heinrich Lohse, and military command elements from Army Group Center. German security priorities focused on maintaining uninterrupted railway transport, suppressing resistance, and extracting resources from the occupied territories. The railway system was essential to moving supplies to the front, particularly as operations shifted deeper into Soviet territory, making Belarusian rail lines a constant target for sabotage. By late 1941, the Soviet State Defense Committee and central headquarters of the partisan movement began directing partisan efforts more systematically. Radio communication was established with some detachments, enabling coordination of sabotage operations. The rail war concept, mass coordinated destruction of rail infrastructure, was introduced as a strategic aim to disrupt German operational mobility. This initiative was supported by trained NKVD and Red Army personnel infiltrated across the front to advise and organize local groups. The population of Belarus faced severe occupation measures, including forced labor, requisitioning of food, and reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding partisans. These policies, combined with the destruction caused by military operations, created fertile ground for resistance recruitment. At the same time, collaborationist formations, including police battalions, operated alongside German security units to suppress partisan activity, making the conflict as much an internal civil struggle as a conventional war. By early 1942, Belarus had become one of the most active centers of Soviet partisan warfare. Dense forests such as the Naliboki and Polisi marshes provided natural cover for large formations, some numbering hundreds of fighters. The rail network running from Brest through Baranovichi, Minsk, and Orsha to Smolensk was of particular importance, carrying supplies to Army Group Center. Even small acts of sabotage, removing rail spikes, damaging bridges, cutting telegraph lines, could delay troop movements or disrupt supply schedules. The rail war would evolve from sporadic attacks into large-scale, centrally coordinated operations aimed at overwhelming the German repair capacity. The opening context of the Belarusian partisan struggle thus combined the region's geographic advantages, the harsh realities of occupation, and the strategic imperatives of both Soviet and German command. From this foundation, the partisan movement would transform into a sophisticated force capable of mounting coordinated campaigns that directly impacted the course of the Eastern Front. The initial phase of organized Belarusian partisan activity began in late 1941 and early 1942, as isolated Red Army soldiers, escaped prisoners of war, and local communist activists regrouped in forested areas. These early detachments were typically small, often numbering between 15 and 50 fighters, and relied on a combination of captured German weapons, hidden pre-war caches, and locally produced supplies. Initial operations were primarily reconnaissance, raids on poorly defended garrisons, and opportunistic acts of sabotage against rail lines and bridges. The Soviet Central Headquarters of the partisan movement, established in May 1942 under the leadership of Panteleimon Ponomarenko, began to exert greater control over these scattered groups. Radio operators were parachuted into occupied Belarus to establish communications, enabling coordinated planning and the relay of intelligence to the Red Army. This period saw the first deliberate integration of partisan sabotage into broader Soviet operational plans, with railway attacks timed to coincide with Red Army offensives on the front. For the German command, partisan activity in Belarus quickly became a major security concern. Army Group Center relied heavily on the Minsk-Smolensk and Brest-Minsk-Orsha rail corridors for supplies, troop movements, and the evacuation of wounded. The Reichsbahn and military transport services operated under tight schedules, and even brief interruptions could affect the tempo of frontline operations. To counter the growing threat, the Germans deployed rear area security units, including Wehrmacht Landesschützen battalions, Ordnungspolizei formations, and collaborationist auxiliary police. Anti-partisan operations, such as Bamberg in March-April 1942, combined sweeps through suspected partisan zones with severe reprisals against villages believed to provide support. Despite these efforts, the partisans adapted their methods. Sabotage teams learned to work in small, mobile groups, moving rapidly to their targets under cover of darkness and dispersing before German forces could respond. Mines and explosive charges were placed under rails at key points, especially near bridges, curves, or embankments where derailments caused maximum damage. In 1942 alone, Belarusian partisans were credited with hundreds of successful railway demolitions, forcing the Germans to allocate significant manpower to guard lines and repair damage. The opening phase also tested the logistical sustainability of the partisan war. Food and ammunition had to be secured locally, leading to the establishment of hidden supply depots and the cultivation of relationships with sympathetic villagers. Medical support was rudimentary. Improvised field hospitals were set up in the forests, staffed by captured Soviet medics or trained fighters. The growing organizational infrastructure allowed partisan forces to expand in both size and capability, laying the groundwork for the large-scale rail war campaigns that would follow in the coming years. By mid-1942, partisan detachments in Belarus had evolved from scattered bands into a coordinated element of Soviet military strategy. This transformation, supported by improved communication, centralized planning, and the gradual buildup of resources, would enable them to move from opportunistic sabotage to planned, large-scale disruption of the German war effort in the occupied territories. By early 1943, the Soviet High Command recognized that the partisan movement in Belarus had developed into a strategic instrument capable of directly influencing the operational situation on the Eastern Front. The central headquarters of the partisan movement, coordinating with the Stavka, issued detailed directives for rail sabotage to be synchronized with planned Red Army offensives. These instructions specified the types of targets, methods of destruction, and timing for operations to maximize disruption to German supply chains. The German command, for its part, adapted by introducing layered defenses along key rail routes. Railway security battalions, Feldgendarmerie detachments, and locally recruited Hilfspolizei were tasked with constant patrols. Observation posts and fortified blockhouses were built at intervals along the lines, often equipped with light artillery or machine guns. Armored trains, armed with flak and heavy weapons, began escorting important freight convoys. Despite these measures, the vast expanse of the rail network and the heavily forested terrain meant that total protection was impossible. Partisan units improved their technical capabilities during this period. Specialists trained in demolition were inserted behind German lines to advise on explosive placement and timing devices. Sabotage teams increasingly used delayed action fuse, allowing them to plant charges and withdraw before German patrols could respond. Attacks were planned to derail trains at points where repairs would be slow, such as on bridges, embankments, or near marshy ground. The logistical aspect of sustaining these operations was formidable. Partisan formations in Belarus grew to include thousands of fighters across multiple brigades. To maintain them, supply drops from Soviet aircraft increased, delivering explosives, weapons, radios, and medical supplies. These missions were risky. Luftwaffe night fighters and German flak batteries targeted low-flying transport planes, and only skilled navigation allowed pilots to locate small forest clearings used as drop zones. German reprisals against suspected partisan-supporting villages intensified. Entire communities were forcibly evacuated, burned, or subjected to mass arrests, as in the operations Cottbus and Hermann. Such measures inflicted severe civilian losses, but did not eliminate partisan activity. Instead, they often drove more recruits into the forests, seeking either revenge or survival outside of German-controlled areas. By mid-1943, the groundwork was laid for the largest and most coordinated phase of the Rail War. The Soviet command aimed to use partisan forces as an operational weapon, not merely a tactical nuisance. The strategy called for a massive, simultaneous wave of railway demolitions to overload German repair capabilities, cut off troop redeployments, and weaken the enemy's ability to respond to the summer offensives on the main front. In Belarus, with its dense network of vital east-west and north-south rail lines, this would become one of the most intense campaigns of sabotage in the entire Eastern Front conflict. The summer of 1943 marked the full implementation of the first large-scale rail war in Belarus, ordered by the Soviet Central Headquarters of the partisan movement to coincide with Operation Kutuzov and other Red Army offensives following the Battle of Kursk. The directive called for thousands of coordinated demolitions across occupied territory in a concentrated time frame. In Belarus alone, over 90 partisan brigades received detailed plans via radio specifying rail segments, timing, and types of explosives to be used. From late July to mid-August, partisan detachments executed sabotage on an unprecedented scale. Explosive charges were placed beneath rails, on sleepers, and at critical junction points. Larger teams targeted bridges and culverts, often requiring night-long efforts to avoid detection. The operations aimed not only to derail trains, but also to damage infrastructure in ways that would require days of repair work rather than hours. German records from August 1943 noted more than 15,000 instances of rail damage in the Army Group Center rear areas during this period, with Belarus accounting for a significant portion. German countermeasures were swift but strained. Railway repair units, Bond Pioneer battalions, were deployed in force, supported by security troops conducting sweeps along damaged lines. Armored trains patrolled key routes, and new security outposts were established closer together to shorten response times. However, the vast distances and simultaneous nature of the attacks made comprehensive protection impossible. In some sectors, trains were halted for days, forcing the diversion of traffic onto less efficient routes. Partisan units adapted to the German response by increasing mobility and dispersal. Small sabotage groups of 3 to 5 fighters operated independently from larger bases, carrying limited explosives to avoid slowing their movements. Many used improvised devices constructed from artillery shells or unexploded bombs modified for rail demolition. This decentralized approach made it harder for German patrols to predict or intercept attacks. The Rail War in 1943 also saw improved Soviet aerial coordination. Night flights delivered not only explosives and weapons, but also leaflets to encourage local support. In certain cases, Soviet aircraft provided diversionary bombing near targeted rail sectors, drawing German forces away while partisans carried out demolitions. This integration of partisan activity into the broader operational picture represented a significant evolution in Soviet irregular warfare doctrine. By the close of the summer campaign, the rail disruption in Belarus had measurably affected German logistics. Delays in troop redeployments, shortages of ammunition and fuel at the front, and the forced rerouting of supplies undermined the operational flexibility of Army Group Center. While the Germans repaired much of the damage within weeks, the partisan actions achieved their goal of constraining German movement during a critical phase of the Eastern Front in 1943. This success reinforced the strategic value of the partisan movement, setting the stage for an even larger and more destructive rail sabotage effort the following year. By early 1944, the partisan command in Belarus was preparing for the most extensive and destructive phase of the rail sabotage campaign, intended to directly support the forthcoming Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration. The Soviet central headquarters of the partisan movement issued orders in February and March for a renewed rail war to commence in the lead-up to the Red Army's advance. The goal was to paralyze German rail transport to such an extent that reserves, ammunition, and supplies could not be brought forward in time to counter the Soviet assault. The planning was detailed and methodical. Each partisan brigade was assigned specific sections of rail lines, bridges, or junctions to destroy, with strict timelines and coordination instructions. Special emphasis was placed on key east-west supply arteries linking Army Group Center's frontline units to the Reich, including the Minsk-Orsha-Smolensk line and the Baranovichi-Brest-Warsaw route. The operations were to be simultaneous across hundreds of kilometers to overwhelm German repair capabilities. In preparation, Soviet aircraft increased resupply missions to partisan zones. Between March and May 1944, thousands of kilograms of explosives, detonators, and timed fuses were delivered by air. In addition, demolition specialists were parachuted in to train local teams in advanced techniques such as placing multiple charges to ensure longer repair times or targeting structural components of bridges rather than the rails alone. These improvements were intended to maximize the operational delay caused by each act of sabotage. The Germans responded with intensified security measures. Army Group Center increased the deployment of Bondpioneer repair units, while the Sicherheitspolizei and Ordnungspolizei carried out large anti-partisan sweeps. Units such as the 286th Security Division conducted operations to clear suspected partisan bases, often burning villages and relocating their populations. Despite these efforts, the forested and swampy terrain of Belarus allowed partisan units to evade capture and reassemble after sweeps. When the new rail war began in early June 1944, the scale of destruction was unprecedented. Reports from the German Transport Command indicated that in just the first 2 weeks of June, over 10,500 rail breaks occurred in the Army Group Center rear area, with Belarus accounting for the majority. Entire stretches of track were rendered unusable for days. German supply schedules collapsed in several sectors, forcing the rerouting of critical shipments through longer, less secure routes and creating bottlenecks that delayed troop movements to the front. By the time many German frontline units began the Soviet offensive already short of ammunition and fuel, and the transfer of reserves was delayed by days, time the Red Army exploited to achieve rapid breakthroughs. The 1944 Rail War thus became a textbook example of strategic sabotage coordinated with conventional operations, demonstrating the capacity of irregular forces to influence the outcome of large-scale military campaigns on the Eastern Front. The peak of the Belarusian Rail War coincided directly with the Soviet summer offensive of 1944. From late June through early July, as Operation Bagration advanced deep into Army Group Center's positions, partisan forces intensified their attacks to levels not previously seen in the conflict. In many areas, railway traffic came to a near standstill for consecutive days, a rare occurrence given the German capacity for rapid repairs earlier in the war. Partisan brigades operating in the Minsk, Baranovichi, and Vitebsk sectors reported dozens of simultaneous demolitions in a single night. These operations were timed to disrupt German troop withdrawals and prevent the movement of reserves from Poland and the Baltic states. In several instances, large German formations, such as elements of the Ninth Army, were forced to abandon planned redeployments due to rail blockages, instead retreating on foot or along overcrowded roads, where they became vulnerable to Soviet air and ground attacks. The effectiveness of these actions rested on both technical skill and logistical coordination. By mid-1944, demolition teams could destroy large bridge sections or embankments in under an hour. Mines and explosives were placed in ways that required German engineers to conduct lengthy reconstructions rather than quick fixes. In addition, partisan units used deception, such as planting decoy charges or triggering small explosions to draw security forces away from primary targets. German countermeasures became increasingly desperate. Armored trains were stationed permanently at high-value junctions, and entire security regiments were pulled from anti-partisan sweeps to guard railway sectors. However, the dispersal of these forces diluted their effectiveness. The necessity of repairing railways under constant threat also slowed the rate of recovery. Work crews required infantry escorts and often labored under artillery harassment from advancing Soviet forces. In some areas, the partisans extended their sabotage beyond the rails themselves. Telegraph and telephone lines were cut to disrupt command communications. Signal boxes and switching stations were destroyed to delay the restoration of normal operations. These attacks compounded the logistical difficulties already facing the Wehrmacht, as train movements could not be efficiently rerouted or scheduled without functioning control systems. By the first week of July 1944, the combined effect of the Red Army's breakthroughs and the partisan rail war had left vast sections of Belarus's transport network in ruins. Entire divisions were trapped or scattered during retreats when rail-based evacuation became impossible. While the Germans continued to repair tracks in the rear, the tempo of the Soviet advance meant that many repaired sections were either recaptured or destroyed again within days. This peak period demonstrated that partisan operations, when precisely timed with frontline offensives, could serve as a decisive strategic tool. The 1944 sabotage campaign in Belarus did not merely harass the enemy, it directly influenced operational outcomes by severing the logistical lifelines of one of Germany's most important army groups during a critical phase of the war. Following the initial success of the summer 1944 sabotage campaign, Belarusian partisan formations adapted to the rapidly shifting conditions brought on by the Soviet advance. As Operation Bagration pushed the front westward, partisan detachments found themselves operating in a transitional zone between fully occupied territory and newly liberated areas. This change required a shift from purely disruptive operations against German supply lines to active cooperation with advancing Red Army units. Many partisan brigades redeployed toward remaining German-controlled rail sectors in western Belarus and eastern Poland. Their missions included continued destruction of rails and bridges ahead of retreating enemy columns, as well as harassment of German engineering units attempting to re-establish communications. In several cases, partisans ambushed repair trains, often lightly guarded due to manpower shortages, capturing tools, explosives, and supplies for further use. The retreat of Army Group Center also created opportunities for interdiction of smaller, isolated German units moving by rail. Partisan intelligence networks, which included railway workers, village informants, and embedded scouts, provided precise movement schedules. This allowed sabotage teams to time demolitions for maximum impact, derailing troop transports or supply trains in locations where recovery would be slow due to damaged infrastructure and Soviet pressure on the flanks. German countermeasures in this phase were less systematic than earlier in the war. Security troops were overstretched, often diverted to holding defensive lines or covering withdrawals. Armored trains and railway guards remained active, but their coverage was sporadic, and coordination with higher command suffered as communications broke down under Soviet offensive pressure. Partisan operations now extended beyond infrastructure to direct control of territory. Brigades secured railway junctions before Red Army units arrived, preventing the Germans from executing planned demolitions or laying mines. In some cases, partisans restored limited railway function for Soviet use by clearing debris or repairing track sections, demonstrating their ability to adapt from sabotage to logistical support. This transitional period also saw the integration of liberated civilians into partisan ranks, swelling numbers in some units by hundreds within weeks. These new recruits, while often lacking combat training, were valuable for labor-intensive tasks such as clearing wreckage, carrying supplies, and guarding captured positions. The partisans' mobility and knowledge of the terrain continued to give them an advantage in pursuing retreating enemy units and disrupting any attempts to stabilize German rear areas. By August 1944, the role of the Belarusian partisans had shifted from a primarily covert sabotage force to an auxiliary operational partner of the Red Army. Their continued focus on rail disruption ensured that the German retreat remained disorganized, while their growing participation in securing infrastructure marked a new stage in the evolution of Soviet partisan warfare. This adaptability would be critical as the conflict moved beyond Belarusian territory and into the final phases of the war in Eastern Europe. By September 1944, the operational landscape for Belarusian partisan forces had changed fundamentally. With most of Belarus liberated and the front lines pushing into Poland and the Baltic states, partisan brigades shifted their focus toward deep penetration missions beyond newly secured Soviet territory. The Soviet command redeployed experienced sabotage units into areas still under German control, where railway infrastructure remained critical for the Wehrmacht's retreat and defensive buildup. In western Belarus and northeastern Poland, small partisan groups crossed into enemy-held zones to continue rail attacks. These operations required longer-range movement, often through hostile terrain and without the support of established partisan bases. Supplies had to be carried in or delivered by airdrop under increasingly challenging conditions, as German air defenses remained strong in these rear sectors. The teams targeted rail lines feeding into major junctions like Białystok and Brest, aiming to cut connections between Army Group Center's remnants and forces in East Prussia. The partisans' experience in Belarusian operations proved vital. Teams employed advanced demolition techniques learned during the 1943-44 Rail War, including the use of multiple linked charges and shaped explosives to inflict maximum structural damage on bridges and tunnels. Some missions required coordination with Soviet long-range aviation, which bombed marshalling yards immediately after sabotage actions to amplify disruption and delay repairs. German security forces, though under pressure, still mounted countersweeps against these incursions. Rear area units, often composed of older soldiers or hastily assembled Volkssturm detachments, attempted to secure vital stretches of track. However, the partisans' mobility and ability to operate in small, self-sufficient groups made them difficult to intercept. The reduced scale of German rail security in these sectors, compared to earlier years, allowed sabotage missions to succeed more frequently. Meanwhile, in liberated Belarus, partisan brigades were reorganized. Some were disbanded, with fighters absorbed into the Red Army, particularly into rifle divisions in need of manpower after months of offensive operations. Others were retained as NKVD-controlled special detachments, tasked with reconnaissance, mopping up operations against isolated German elements, and the clearing of mines and booby traps left on railways by retreating forces. This transitional phase underscored the adaptability of the Belarusian partisan movement. Having spent years perfecting the art of rail sabotage, its veterans now extended their expertise beyond Belarus, contributing to the continued degradation of German logistical capacity as the Eastern Front moved steadily toward the borders of the Reich. Their operational reach, once limited to forest strongholds, now extended hundreds of kilometers beyond, demonstrating the enduring relevance of partisan warfare even in the closing stages of the conflict. By the final months of 1944 and into early 1945, the operational role of the Belarusian partisan movement had shifted decisively from long-term guerrilla warfare toward short-duration, high-impact missions in territories still under German control. With Belarus fully liberated, many veteran units were redeployed to assist Soviet advances in Poland, East Prussia, and the Baltic states. Their continued focus on railway sabotage targeted the last functioning supply lines feeding German defensive positions along the Vistula, Oder, and in the Courland pocket. In eastern Poland, partisan demolition teams operated alongside Soviet reconnaissance and forward detachments, striking rail lines that connected German forces on the Vistula with supply depots in Silesia and Pomerania. Bridges over major rivers, such as the Bug and the Nero, became prime targets, as destroying them could halt entire troop convoys for days. These missions required precise coordination. Reconnaissance scouts identified weak points, engineers prepared charges, and covering units engaged any nearby German patrols to protect the sabotage team's withdrawal. The German command, aware of the impact of such attacks, maintained concentrated security around key railway arteries, but their resources were overstretched. Luftwaffe reconnaissance still patrolled the skies, but fuel shortages limited flight hours. Armored trains and fortified railway posts were deployed mainly in sectors judged most critical, leaving secondary routes vulnerable. Partisans exploited this by hitting bypass lines and feeder tracks, forcing the Wehrmacht to overload the primary routes, and thus making them easier to target in subsequent operations. Within Belarus itself, the remnants of organized partisan brigades took on a different function. Many were integrated into NKVD border guard units tasked with securing newly restored Soviet rail operations against sabotage by German stay-behind elements or anti-Soviet nationalist groups. The same skills used for destroying rail lines were now applied to their protection, patrolling vulnerable sections, guarding bridges, and clearing mines planted during the German retreat. As the Red Army closed in on German territory, partisan activity increasingly merged with conventional operations. In January 1945, during the Vistula-Oder offensive, former Belarusian partisan groups participated in coordinated demolition raids deep behind enemy lines to disrupt reinforcements moving toward the front. These actions, while smaller in scale than the 1943-44 rail wars, had strategic effects due to the critical shortage of German rolling stock, fuel, and repair crews by this late stage of the war. By March 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin, the era of the Belarusian partisan rail campaign was effectively over. The movement's veterans, many of whom had spent years in forest encampments conducting sabotage, were either demobilized, absorbed into regular military formations, or assigned to internal security duties in liberated territories. Their long-running war on German railway infrastructure had spanned from improvised small-unit attacks in 1941 to a fully integrated component of Soviet strategic planning by 1944, leaving a significant imprint on the Eastern Front's logistical and operational history. The legacy of the Belarusian partisan rail war was shaped by both its military impact and its post-war political significance. From 1941 to 1944, partisan sabotage against railway infrastructure in Belarus evolved from scattered, opportunistic attacks into a coordinated strategic campaign, integrated with Red Army offensives. The documented effect on German logistics, thousands of rail breaks, the destruction of hundreds of bridges, and repeated disruption of troop and supply movements became a case study in irregular warfare contributing to conventional victory. In the immediate post-war years, Soviet military historians and planners treated the rail war as a model for the integration of partisan operations into operational-level strategy. Training manuals for the Soviet armed forces in the late 1940s and 1950s cited the Belarusian experience as evidence that irregular forces, when centrally directed and adequately supplied, could paralyze a technologically superior enemy's communications network. Many former partisan commanders were honored with state decorations and integrated into the political or military leadership of the Belarusian SSR. For Belarus itself, the wartime partisan movement became a foundational element of the republic's official memory. Monuments were erected at major sites of sabotage, and rail junctions destroyed during the conflict were commemorated in memorial plaques. Cities such as Minsk, Vitebsk, and Gomel hosted annual ceremonies honoring veterans of the partisan brigades, while museums dedicated extensive exhibits to the rail war, displaying preserved demolition equipment, captured German railway weapons, and detailed operational maps. However, the memory of the partisan war was also shaped by the political climate of the post-war Soviet Union. Official narratives emphasized unity between local civilians and Soviet command, downplaying instances of tension, reprisals, or the forced requisitioning of resources from villages. The complex reality that partisan warfare involved both voluntary and coerced participation, and that it often brought devastating German retaliation, was largely absent from public discourse until after the collapse of the USSR. Internationally, military analysts outside the Soviet bloc recognized the Belarusian rail war as a rare example of irregular forces achieving strategic-level disruption against a major power. NATO studies in the 1950s examined Soviet partisan doctrine for potential application in Cold War scenarios, particularly in planning for resistance movements in the event of occupation. The emphasis on rail sabotage, mobility, and integration with conventional offensives remained a recurring theme in such analyses. Today, the rail war is remembered in Belarus both as a symbol of national resistance and as a key contribution to the Soviet victory on the Eastern Front. Its operational lessons regarding the vulnerability of transportation infrastructure, the necessity of local support networks, and the coordination of irregular and regular forces retain relevance in modern military strategy. The campaign's scale and effectiveness ensure its place in the broader history of World War II, standing as one of the most sustained and impactful partisan sabotage efforts of the conflict.